The air in the west wing had grown thin and cold, tasting of lilies and old stone. It was the scent of formal grief, an oppressive perfume that clung to the velvet draperies and settled deep in the lungs. For 3 days it had been the only air Maya breathed. Draven found her there, a silhouette against the tall, arched window, staring out at the gardens where the last of the autumn roses were shedding their petals like drops of blood on the frost-kissed grass. Her sister, Elara, had loved those roses. Now the world seemed determined to erase every trace of her. He didn't speak, not at first. Words were useless anchors in this sea of sorrow. Instead, he came to stand beside her, his presence a solid weight in the echoing silence of the room. He could feel the tremor that ran through her, a constant, shivering hum of loss that had taken root in her bones. Her hands were clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white stones in the gray light. He watched her profile, the proud line of her jaw, softened by a sorrow so profound it seemed to have physically reshaped her. "The arrangements are made," he said, his voice a low murmur, careful not to shatter the fragile stillness. "Tomorrow, at midday." Maya gave a small, sharp nod, her gaze fixed on the dying garden. "I know." He saw the reflection of the room in the window pane, a distorted world of shadow and faint light. In it he was a king, broad-shouldered and draped in the dark, severe lines of mourning clothes. But beside her, he felt stripped of all title, reduced to a man watching the woman he loved drown. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them before he settled it over her clasped ones. Her skin was like ice. "I will be there," he promised, his thumb stroking the rigid bones of her hand. "I will be right beside you. You will not face this alone." She finally turned her head, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, usually so full of fire and wit, were hollowed out, empty. But in their depths, a flicker of something fragile and desperate surfaced. A plea. "Hold my hand, Draven. When they lower her into the ground, I need you to be holding my hand. Tightly, so I don't fall in after her." The words were a ghost of a whisper, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I will," he swore, his voice thick with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. He tightened his grip, enveloping her frozen hands in the warmth of his own. "I swear it, Maya. Nothing on this earth will keep me from it." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair, now mingled with the funereal lilies. For a long moment they stood like that, two figures carved from the same stone, braced against the coming tide. His promise was a shield, a fortress, the one solid thing in a world that had fractured beneath her feet. And in the cold, silent room, she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 days, to lean into him, to believe him. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and weeping, the sky a seamless shroud of bruised cloud. Draven dressed in silence, the starched black fabric of his formal coat feeling abrasive against his skin. His valet laid out the insignias of his office, the heavy chain and the somber signet, but he waved them away. Today, he was not a king. He was a husband, a man with a promise to keep. He found Maya waiting by the door, her face a pale mask beneath a delicate black veil. She did not look at him, but when he offered his arm, she took it, her fingers a cold pressure on his sleeve. They were halfway down the grand marble staircase when Lord Valerius intercepted them, his face a mask of harried importance. The man was a creature of parchment and sealing wax, his veins seemingly running with ink instead of blood. "Your Majesty," he began, bowing low, his voice a reedy intrusion. "1,000 pardons for the interruption at such a time, but an urgent dispatch has arrived from the northern port. The grain merchants of Oakhaven are refusing the new tariffs. They've blockaded the harbor." Draven's focus, which had been narrowed to the singular point of Maya's cold hand on his arm, was forcibly wrenched away. "A blockade? Over a 2% tariff increase? That's absurd." He could feel the familiar weight of the crown settling back onto his brow, heavy and demanding. They claim it violates a century-old charter, Your Majesty. Counselor Hemlock is in the strategy room. He advises immediate intervention, a show of strength. Of course he does, Draven muttered, the old irritation flaring. Hemlock's only tool was a hammer. Valerius, you and Hemlock can draft a response. Emphasize the Crown's disappointment. Propose a temporary suspension of the tariff pending review. It's a trivial matter, a posture. They'll relent. He turned to continue down the stairs, but Valerius, emboldened by panic, stepped in his path. Your Majesty, with respect, they are not posturing. The dispatch suggests they are backed by emissaries from our dear neighbors in Eldoria. This is not a trade dispute. It is a challenge to your authority. Your personal seal is required on the response. Your direct command. To delegate now would be seen as weakness. The words landed like stones. Weakness, authority, the twin specters that haunted his reign. His father's ghost was at his shoulder, whispering of duty, of the unblinking eye of the king. He glanced at the great clock in the hall. 10 in the morning. The funeral was at noon. This will not take long, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He felt Maya's fingers tighten on his arm, a silent, desperate question. He turned to her, forcing a reassuring smile that felt like a grimace. My love, go on ahead with the cortege. I will handle this foolishness and be with you long before midday. I will be there, I promise. He saw the doubt warring with the need to believe in her eyes. Draven, she started, her voice barely audible. An hour. At most, he insisted, already pulling his arm free. He gave her hand a final, firm squeeze. I will not be late. He turned and strode toward the strategy room, the sound of his boots echoing on the marble, each step a betrayal he did not yet recognize. Valerius scurried behind him, already unfurling a scroll. The scent of lilies faded, replaced by the dry, dusty smell of politics and power. He was the king again, and the king had his duties. He told himself it was a matter of an hour, a single, insignificant hour. The strategy room was a cage of maps and frantic whispers. What was meant to be a simple matter of drafting a decree devolved into a spiraling debate. Counselor Hemlock, a man whose jowls quivered with self-importance, argued for mobilizing a battalion. Valerius wrung his hands and spoke of economic collapse. Emissaries were summoned, scribes were dispatched, and every word of the royal response was dissected and reassembled. The great clock in the hall chimed the half-hour, then the hour. Draven heard it, a dull clang in the back of his mind, a note of discord in the symphony of statecraft. I have time, he thought, dipping his quill into the inkpot. This is important. This is for the stability of the kingdom. Maya will understand. He argued over the precise wording of a subordinate clause, his focus narrowed to the point of a pin. He was defending his authority, projecting the strength his father had always demanded. The sun, weak as it was, climbed to its zenith, its watery light slanting through the high, narrow windows. Draven didn't notice. He was hunched over the great oak table, a general commanding an army of words, utterly blind to the real battle he was losing elsewhere. He was so consumed with preventing the perception of weakness that he failed to see the catastrophic weakness of his own character in that very moment. It was the sudden, frantic tolling of the chapel bells that finally broke the spell. Not the single, solemn bell for the funeral procession, but the cascading peal that signaled its conclusion. 12 chimes, followed by a resonant silence. Midday. The quill slipped from Draven's fingers, spattering a black tear of ink across the pristine parchment. A cold dread, colder than the grave Maya was now standing beside, washed over him. He looked up, his eyes wide with a horror that silenced the room. Hemlock, mid-sentence, let his jaw hang slack. Valerius flinched as if struck. No, Draven whispered. He shoved himself away from the table, the heavy chair screeching in protest. He ran. He sprinted from the room, down the long corridors, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, panicked rhythm. He ignored the shocked faces of the guards, the startled calls of his counselors. The air was thick with his failure. He burst out of the palace doors and into the courtyard, his breath tearing from his lungs. The royal carriage was gone. The entire procession was gone. He commandeered the nearest horse, a guardsman's stallion, and galloped out of the palace gates, heedless of rank or protocol. He rode like a madman, the wind whipping at his face, tearing at his fine morning coat. He urged the horse faster, faster, as if he could outrun the tolling of the bells, as if he could somehow turn back the sun in the sky. The city blurred around him, a smear of gray stone and solemn faces. He saw the black-clad citizens turning from the direction of the royal cemetery, their duty done, their condolences paid. He reached the cemetery gates just as the last of the mourners were departing. The air was damp and smelled of freshly turned earth. He dismounted, his legs unsteady, and staggered toward the family mausoleum. There it was, a rectangle of dark, raw soil beside the cold marble of her ancestors. A wound in the earth. It was finished. Bouquets of white lilies lay wilting on the mound. He had missed it all. He had not been there. Her sister was in the ground, and he had not been there to hold her hand. He saw her then, standing alone a short distance away, her back to him. Her veil had been thrown back, and her shoulders were rigid. She wasn't weeping. The stillness of her form was more terrifying than any storm of tears. He took a step toward her, his throat closing around her name. Maya. She didn't turn. She didn't move. It was as if she hadn't heard him, or as if the sound of his voice was no more significant than the rustling of the dead leaves at her feet. He had broken his oath. He had broken the one promise that mattered, and in the devastating silence of the graveyard, he understood that he had broken something far, far more important. He stood there, the king of 1,000 leagues of land, the master of armies and treasuries, and he had never felt so powerless, so utterly and completely bankrupt. The smell of damp earth and dying flowers was the scent of his own monumental, unforgivable failure. The ride back to the palace was a slow, agonizing procession of one. Draven let the horse walk, its hooves a funereal drumbeat on the cobblestones. The city looked different, its familiar lines sharpened into an accusation. Every window seemed like a watching eye, every shadow a pointing finger. He was a king returning from a battle he had not realized he was fighting, only to find his entire world burned to the ground behind him. He had chosen parchment over her pain, a trade dispute over her final goodbye. The thought was a physical sickness, coiling in his gut. He entered the palace through a side gate, avoiding the questioning eyes of the royal guard. The great halls, usually bustling with the quiet efficiency of servants and courtiers, were hushed. The silence was a living thing, vast and suffocating. It followed him up the grand staircase, clung to him as he walked the long, carpeted corridor to their chambers. He pushed the heavy oak doors open, a desperate, foolish hope fluttering in his chest. She will be here. She will be angry. She will scream at me, but she will be here. The rooms were empty. The air was still and cold, carrying no trace of her scent, no hint of her presence. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but remained unlit, a pyre of cold gray logs. The vast chamber felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life that had just ended. His life with her. He walked through the sitting room, his steps unnervingly loud on the polished floorboards, and into their bedroom. The great canopied bed was perfectly made, the silken coverlet smooth and undisturbed. It had not been slept in. It had not been wept in. His gaze fell upon his desk, a massive piece of dark mahogany where he so often worked late into the night, poring over the very documents that had stolen him from her side. Something glinted in the fading afternoon light. He moved toward it, his legs feeling heavy, as if he were wading through deep water. There, in the center of the polished wood, sat her wedding ring. The simple band of pale gold, intertwined with another of white silver, representing the union of their two houses, their two hearts. It looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile, lying there alone. Beside it was a folded piece of cream-colored stationery, her personal correspondence paper. His name was written on the outside in her elegant, familiar script. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The paper was cool to the touch, and the sharp creases felt like a judgment. He unfolded it. The message was short, each word a perfectly crafted dagger aimed at his heart. You chose paperwork over my goodbye. Now say goodbye to me. That was all. No signature. None was needed. The words imprinted themselves on his mind, burning like a brand. He read them again and again, the ink blurring through the sudden hot sting of tears. He sank into his chair, the one he had sat in just hours before, feeling so powerful, so in control. The ring lay before him, a circle of condemnation. It was the symbol of his most sacred vow, abandoned on the altar of his most trivial duties. He had held the fate of a harbor in his hands and let her slip through his fingers. He had guarded his authority, and in doing so, had forfeited his entire world. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged noise of pure agony that was utterly unfit for a king. He swept his arm across the desk, sending stacks of treaties, tariffs, and reports cascading to the floor. The carefully organized architecture of his power lay in a scattered mess at his feet, as worthless as dust. He clutched the note in his fist, crumpling the paper until his knuckles were white, the sharp edges digging into his palm. The physical pain was a dim echo of the chasm that had just opened inside him. She was gone. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea for him to do better. It was a statement of fact. A verdict delivered. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. The silence of the room pressed in, no longer empty, but filled with the deafening sound of her absence. He looked at the scattered papers on the floor, the instruments of his ruin, and for the first time, he saw them for what they were. Not the tools of a king, but the bars of a cage he had built for himself. A cage he had locked her out of, leaving her to face the wolves of her grief all alone. For a long time he did not move. He simply sat there, the crumpled note in one hand, her ring cold and heavy in the palm of the other, while the shadows lengthened and consumed the room, leaving him utterly alone in the dark. The darkness did not bring counsel. It brought only the stark, repeating image of Maya's face at the window, the hollowed-out look in her eyes, the ghost of her voice asking him to hold her hand. The memory was a torment, a relentless indictment he could not escape. He did not sleep. How could he, when every closed-eyed moment was filled with the sight of a fresh grave he hadn't been present for? Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, a frantic clarity pierced through the fog of his grief and self-loathing. The cabin. It was her family's place, nestled deep in the Whisperwood, 100 leagues north. It was the place she'd spoken of when the pressures of court became too much, her voice softening with a nostalgic warmth. It was her sanctuary, the repository of her childhood memories, the one place on earth that the crown had not yet touched, had not yet tainted. If she had gone anywhere to escape him, to escape everything, it would be there. A desperate primal energy surged through him. He rose from the chair, his limbs stiff, his body aching with the peculiar exhaustion that comes from emotional devastation. He strode to his wardrobe, ignoring the rows of immaculate royal attire. He pulled on simple leather breeches, a plain woolen tunic, and a heavy hooded traveling cloak. He was not a king on a royal progress. He was a man, a broken man, in pursuit of his own heart. He strapped on a sword belt, more out of habit than intention, and shoved her ring deep into his pocket. Its cool metallic weight against his thigh was a constant, painful reminder of his purpose. He slipped out of the castle like a thief, using the same servant passages he'd learned as a boy. The guards at the stables were startled to see him, their king, alone and dressed as a common traveler before the sun had even risen. He did not explain. He simply chose the fastest, strongest horse in the royal mews, a black destrier named Midnight, and swung himself into the saddle. "No one is to follow me," he commanded, his voice raw and harsh. "No one." The guards, stunned into obedience, simply nodded as he wheeled the horse around and galloped out into the pre-dawn gloom. The journey was a blur of wind and thundering hooves, a desperate flight from the suffocating stillness of the palace. He pushed the horse mercilessly, stopping only when the animal was lathered and trembling, allowing it brief rests for water and grain before pressing on. He barely ate, barely slept. Gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a fitting companion to the gaping void in his soul. The world outside the capital was a tapestry of muted autumn colors. The rolling hills gave way to dense forests, the trees shedding their fiery leaves like embers from a dying fire. The air grew colder, sharper, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of the wilderness, the smell of her world. As he rode, his mind was a battleground of memory and regret. He remembered Alara, her easy laughter and sharp wit, so like Maya's. He remembered the three of them walking in the palace gardens, Alara teasing him about his formal seriousness, Maya linking her arm through his, her smile a beacon. He had loved her sister too, and he had failed her. He had failed them both. He saw Maya's face everywhere, in the dappled sunlight breaking through the canopy of trees, in the reflection on a still forest pool, in the shape of the crescent moon that hung in the night sky. Each vision was a fresh stab of pain. He recalled conversations he'd half listened to, moments he'd let slip by, always distracted by some dispatch, some petitioner, some trivial demand on his time that had felt, in the moment, like the most important thing in the world. How could he have been so blind? He had treated her love as a given, a constant and unshakable foundation upon which he could build his reign. He had never considered that the foundation itself required tending, that it could crack, that it could crumble into dust if neglected. On the third day, the forest deepened. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense canopy that plunged the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. This was the Whisperwood. He was close. His exhaustion was a heavy cloak on his shoulders, but adrenaline and a desperate, terrified hope urged him onward. He followed the winding, barely there path he remembered from a map Maya had once shown him, her finger tracing the route to her childhood haven. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, searching fingers of golden light through the trees, he smelled it. Wood smoke. A thin gray plume curled into the sky just ahead. His heart seized in his chest. He slowed Midnight to a walk, the horse's heavy breaths loud in the profound silence of the ancient forest. He dismounted, tethering the horse to a low-hanging branch, and proceeded on foot, his boots sinking into a soft carpet of pine needles. And then he saw it. The cabin was small, built of dark, weathered logs, nestled in a small clearing beside a fast-running creek. It looked as if it had grown from the earth itself. A warm, yellow light glowed in its single window. It was real. She was real. She was here. He crept closer, his movements slow and cautious, like a hunter stalking a wounded deer. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the trunk of a massive oak. He could see her through the window. She was sitting at a small wooden table, steaming mug cradled in her hands, her profile illuminated by the flickering light of an oil lamp. She was wearing a simple homespun dress, her hair unbound and falling over her shoulders in a dark cascade. She looked smaller and achingly beautiful. She was staring into the fire crackling in the stone hearth, her expression unreadable, lost in a world of her own making. He stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe. The sight of her, safe and whole, was a relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. But it was followed swiftly by a wave of terror. She was here, in this world that was entirely hers, a world that had no place for a king. What if she wouldn't see him? What if she sent him away? The thought was more terrifying than any army, any rebellion. He had to try. He had to face her. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he stepped out from behind the tree and walked across the clearing. His footsteps were unnaturally loud on the crisp leaves. He reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the rough-hewn wood. This was it, the last battle. He raised his fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the silent woods, a summons and a plea all in one. The sound of his knock hung in the air, a sharp, unnatural intrusion into the quiet world she had built around herself. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement from within, no sound but the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the nearby creek. Draven's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He thought, for one terrible second, that she would simply ignore him, that she would leave him standing on her doorstep until the cold and the darkness drove him away. It was a fate he knew he deserved. Then he heard the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps approached the door. The latch clicked, a sound as final as a guillotine's release, and the door swung inward. She stood before him, framed in the warm, golden light of the cabin. She was not surprised. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had been expecting him all along. Her eyes, those stormy seas of gray and green, were not hollowed out as they had been in the garden, but they were cold, glacially cold. They looked at him not with hatred or anger or even sorrow, but with a flat, devastating emptiness. It was the look one gives a stranger, a matter of no consequence. "Draven," she said, and his name on her lips was not an endearment but a simple statement of fact. She did not move aside to let him in. She stood her ground, a silent, immovable guardian of her own sanctuary. "Maya," he breathed, his voice rough with exhaustion and disuse. Words failed him. All the speeches he had rehearsed on the long ride north, all the eloquent apologies and desperate pleas, they all evaporated in the face of her profound stillness. He could only stare at her, drinking in the sight of her, reality of her, while the chasm of his failure yawned between them. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. There was no tremor in it, no hint of the broken woman he had left behind. This was someone new, someone forged in the fire of his betrayal. "I had to come," he managed, taking a half step forward. "I had to see you, to talk to you." "There is nothing to talk about," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "You made your choice. The kingdom needed you. I understand. A king has his duties." The words were reasonable, placid, but they were laced with a venomous irony that cut him deeper than any shouted accusation could have. She was dismissing him with the very logic he had used to dismiss her. "No," he said, shaking his head, a desperate denial. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't a choice. It was a mistake. The most terrible mistake of my life. I was a fool, Maya, a blind, arrogant fool." A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or just weary contempt, crossed her features before being extinguished. "You were a king," she corrected him softly. "And a king chose his kingdom. It is the story of every king in every age. There is nothing new here." She made a move to close the door. The thought of that door shutting, of being left alone in the encroaching darkness, sent a jolt of pure panic through him. He reached out, not to touch her, but to press his hand flat against the wood of the door, stopping its movement. "Please," he begged, and the word was a ragged shard of sound. "Maya, please, just let me say what I came to say." She looked at his hand, then back to his face. For a long moment, she considered it. He saw the struggle in her, the deep, instinctual desire to protect herself from any more pain he might inflict, warring with some lingering ember of the woman who had once loved him. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the world, she stepped back, pulling the door open. "5 minutes," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. He stepped across the threshold, and it felt like crossing into another world. The cabin was small and simple, but it was filled with her. A shawl she had been knitting lay across a chair, its wooden needles still in the yarn. A book lay open on the table, beside her half-empty mug. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and her. It was the scent of a life he had just lost. He turned to face her, standing in the center of the small room, a giant in a doll's house, his presence too large, too loud, too much. She had not sat down. She stood by the hearth, her arms crossed over her chest, a defensive posture that made the space between them feel like 100 leagues. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the hard lines of her resolve. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say that would matter? What apology could possibly be enough to bridge this canyon? The silence stretched, thick and heavy. And in that silence, he knew that words were not enough. They were the currency of his world, the tools he used to rule, but they were worthless here. Here, in the heart of her pain, only one thing would suffice. He dropped to his knees. The movement was abrupt, unkingly. The hard wooden floorboards pressed into his kneecaps. He didn't care. He looked up at her, stripping himself of every last shred of pride, of title, of power. He was just a man, on his knees, begging for his life from the woman who held it in her hands. I have no excuse, he began, his voice cracking. There is no justification for what I did. I broke my word. I broke my oath to you. I left you alone when you needed me most, and I will carry the shame of that to my grave. I chose the crown. I chose the idea of being a king over the reality of being your husband. And I was wrong, utterly, damnably wrong. Tears streamed down his face now, hot and shameful, but he didn't wipe them away. He wanted her to see him, to see all of him, to see the pathetic, broken thing he was without her. I love you, Maya, he choked out. More than my life, more than my kingdom, more than my own soul. I know I have not shown it. I have hidden behind my duties. I have used my responsibilities as a shield because I was a coward. I was afraid of failing as a king, the way my father always told me I would. But in trying not to fail the kingdom, I have committed the only failure that has ever truly mattered. I have failed you. He took a shuddering breath. I am begging you, not as your king, but as the man who swore to love you. Give me one more chance. One more chance to prove that you are my world. Not the crown, not the kingdom. You. Maya watched him, her expression unchanging. The firelight flickered in her cold, still eyes. His words, his tears, his position of supplication, they seemed to wash over her like water over stone, leaving no impression. He had laid his soul bare at her feet, and she had not moved an inch. The silence that followed his desperate plea was the most profound and terrifying silence he had ever known. His hope, which had flared so brightly, began to die, turning to cold ash in his chest. His plea hung in the air, a raw, open wound. Maya's silence was a physical thing, a pressure in the room that was heavier than any crown. She looked down at him, this powerful man, this king, kneeling on the rough floor of her sanctuary, his face streaked with tears, his carefully constructed world shattered around him. A part of her, the part that still ached with the memory of love, wanted to reach out, to smooth the lines of anguish from his brow, to tell him it was all right. But that part of her was buried under a mountain of fresh earth, interred with her sister. Words are easy, Draven, she said finally, her voice low and steady. You have a kingdom full of them. You can build castles with them, command armies. But they are hollow. You stood in my mother's sitting room, and you gave me your word. You swore an oath, and it meant nothing the moment a piece of parchment arrived. It will be different, he insisted, his voice raw with desperation. I see it now. I see everything I was doing wrong. Do you? She asked, a spark of her old fire flashing in her eyes. It was the first real emotion he had seen. Do you see the years of it? The dinners you missed for a meeting with the exchequer? The conversations you never heard because you were reading a report over my shoulder? The 1,000 small ways you chose the crown over me? Over us? This wasn't the first time, Draven. It was just the last. It was the one that I could not forgive. The one that proved to me that I would always, always come second. Her words were true. Each one was a nail hammered into the coffin of his arrogance. He had been doing this for years, chipping away at their foundation with his relentless, obsessive sense of duty. He had believed he was serving them both, securing their future, but he had been starving their present. Then let me show you, he said, his gaze locked on hers. Don't believe my words. Let me show you. With a surge of purpose, he rose to his feet. He walked to the cabin door and threw it open, letting the cold night air rush in. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the forest quiet. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the pines. Then, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was Rhys, the captain of his personal guard, the one man he trusted implicitly, who must have followed him at a discreet distance. Protocol be damned. Rhys approached, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes darted from the king's ravaged expression to the queen's rigid posture. He stopped a respectful distance from the doorway and bowed. Your Majesty. Draven ignored the formality. Rhys, he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was different now, not the authority of a king commanding a subject, but of a man making an irrevocable choice. You will ride back to the capital. You will ride without stopping. You will deliver a message to Lord Valerius and the entire council. He paused, turning his head to look back at Maya. He wanted her to hear this. He needed her to witness it. Tell them that King Draven is on indefinite leave from his duties. All matters of state are to be handled by the Royal Council until further notice. All petitions are to be deferred. All audiences are cancelled. The Northern Port dispute is to be resolved by whatever means they deem necessary. I no longer care. My seal is to be left in the Council's trust. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the next words costing him more than any treaty or declaration ever had. And yet they were the truest words he had ever spoken. Tell them the king's sole and only priority is his wife. He will not be returning to the palace. He will not be attending to any matter of state, no matter how urgent, until she is ready for him to do so. His place is with her. That is all. Rhys's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. This was not just a delegation of duty. It was an abdication, however temporary. It was an earthquake that would shake the foundations of the kingdom. He looked from Draven to Maya, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, her expression still unreadable. He bowed again, deeper this time. It will be done, Your Majesty. Go, Draven commanded. Now. Rhys turned without another word, melting back into the darkness. A moment later, they heard the sound of a horse galloping away, the hoofbeats fading into the vast, silent wilderness. Draven turned back to Maya. He had done it. He had severed the chains, thrown the crown into the sea. He stood before her now, not as a king, but only as a man. He was terrified. He had just gambled his entire kingdom on a single, desperate hope. The cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire. Maya had not moved. Her arms were still crossed, but he saw a tremor run through her, a fine, barely visible shiver. He had breached her walls. He had fired a cannonball at her fortress of solitude, and he saw, for the first time, a crack in the stone. She stared at him, her eyes wide now, the coldness in them receding, replaced by a dawning, disbelieving shock. He had done the one thing she had never imagined he could do. He had let go. He had chosen her, not in word, but in deed. A deed with consequences so massive they were almost impossible to comprehend. The Royal Council, a nest of vipers and ambitious peacocks, left to their own devices? The Northern Lords, unchecked? It was madness. It was unthinkable. And he had done it. For her. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a slow, glittering path down her cheek. It was the first tear he had seen her shed since her sister's death. It was a tear for her sister, for her grief, for the husband she thought she had lost, and for the man who had just set fire to his own world in a desperate, magnificent attempt to find his way back to her. He did not move toward her. He did not press his advantage. He had made his move, and now the choice was hers. He stood in the open doorway, letting the cold wind wash over him, and waited. He would wait for an eternity if he had to. The silence that followed the departure of his messenger was of a different quality. It was no longer a weapon, a shield she wielded against him. It was something more fragile, a space for thought, for feeling. The cold night air spilling through the open door seemed to carry away the stale atmosphere of grief and recrimination, leaving something clean and raw in its place. Maya finally uncrossed her arms, her hands falling to her sides. She wiped the solitary tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, a small, unconscious gesture that spoke of a vulnerability she had refused to show him. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice husky. "They will tear the kingdom apart." "Then let them," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "It is a kingdom of dust without you. I would rather be a beggar with you than a king alone in that cold, empty palace." He saw her throat work as she swallowed. She believed him. The truth of his words was stark and undeniable, proven by the hoofbeats now fading into the immense northern wilderness. He had just committed an act of political suicide, a dereliction of duty that would be spoken of by historians for centuries. And he had done it without hesitation. "My sister is dead," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. It was the first time she had said it to him directly. "She's gone, and you weren't there." The accusation was there, but its sharp edges had been worn down, eroded by the sheer, shocking scale of his sacrifice. What was left was the simple, aching pain of it. "I know," he said, and his own voice was thick with unshed tears. "And I can never change that. I can never give you that moment back. All I can do is promise you that for every moment we have left, I will be there. I will never choose a piece of paper over your hand again. I will never let you face anything alone. Not for an hour, not for a minute." He took a hesitant step into the room, then another. He was close enough now to see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, to see the faint tremor in her lower lip. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the cool, smooth circle of her wedding ring. He pulled it out and held it in his open palm, offering it to her. It glinted in the firelight, a small, golden promise. "This is yours," he said softly, "if you will have it, and the man who goes with it." Maya looked from the ring in his palm to his face. She saw the truth there, the raw, unvarnished fear and hope warring in his eyes. He was not a king. He was just Draven. Her Draven, the man she had fallen in love with long before he wore a crown. The man who used to read poetry to her by the fire. The man who knew that she took honey but no milk in her tea. That man had been buried for years beneath the weight of a kingdom, but now, here he was, resurrected by his own desperate act of love. Slowly, as if her arm were impossibly heavy, she lifted her left hand. It was bare, pale, and trembling slightly. She did not take the ring. She simply held her hand out to him, an invitation. Understanding dawned on him, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He took her hand in his. Her skin was still cool, but it was no longer the deathly ice of the morning room. There was life in it. With his other hand, he picked up the ring from his palm and, with painstaking care, slid it back onto her finger. It settled into place, a perfect fit, a homecoming. He did not release her hand. He held it gently, his thumb stroking her knuckles, just as he had done in the West Wing what felt like a lifetime ago. But this time, it was not a promise of a future act. It was the act itself. It was the beginning of the long, slow work of keeping his vow. She looked down at their joined hands, at the familiar gold band back where it belonged. Another tear fell, then another. This time, she didn't wipe them away. The dam of her composure, so carefully constructed, finally broke. A sob escaped her, then another, and she crumpled, her grief for her sister, for the days of loneliness, for the pain of his betrayal, all of it pouring out of her at once. He was there. He closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. He held her tightly as she wept, her small body shaking with the force of her sorrow. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, and whispered her name over and over again, a prayer, a litany. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false comforts. He just held her. He was her anchor in the storm, the solid ground beneath her feet. He was finally doing the one thing she had asked of him. He was holding on so she wouldn't fall. They stood like that for a long time, locked in an embrace by the warmth of the fire while the cold night deepened outside. The kingdom could wait. The world could wait. The past could not be changed, and the future was uncertain. But in the small, quiet space of the cabin, a husband held his wife as she grieved, and in the simple, profound act of being present, a new foundation was laid, stone by painful, precious stone. The fire in the hearth burned low, its crackling subsiding to a soft, rhythmic hiss. The storm of Maya's grief had passed, leaving in its wake a profound, shared stillness. She was still leaning against him, the solid wall of his chest a comfort she hadn't realized how much she'd missed. He had not let her go, not for a moment. His arms were a fortress around her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt safe. She finally stirred, pulling back just enough to look up at him. His face, illuminated by the dying embers, was a landscape of contrition and bone-deep weariness. But in his eyes, there was a clarity she had not seen in years, a focus that was directed entirely, solely, at her. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "You cannot simply abandon your post. The kingdom." "The kingdom has a council," he interrupted gently but firmly. "It has ministers and laws. It will survive. For years, I told myself that I was the only thing holding it all together. That every decision, no matter how small, rested on my shoulders. That was my pride, Maya. My arrogance. I made myself essential because it was easier than facing what I was truly afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" she asked, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, rhythmic beat beneath her palm. He took a deep breath, the confession seeming to cost him a great deal. Of failing. Of not being him. He didn't have to say the name. His father. King Theron, the conqueror, the lawgiver. A man whose shadow had stretched long over Draven's entire life. He lived and breathed for the crown. He saw love, family, as distractions, weaknesses. He taught me that a king's heart must belong to his people, not to one person. I spent my whole life trying to be the king he wanted me to be, and I almost lost the one person who taught me how to be a man. The admission settled between them, a truth that explained so much. All those years of him choosing duty, it wasn't that he loved her less, it was that he was terrified of a ghost, fighting a war with a dead man's expectations. "You are not your father, Draven," she said softly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his tunic. "I know that now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Standing in that graveyard, seeing that fresh earth, I realized that I didn't care if I lost the respect of my father's ghost. I only cared that I had lost yours." He brought his hand up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. "My reign begins now, Maya. Not the day I was crowned, but today. And the first law of my new kingdom is this: you come first. Always. Before council, before tariffs, before any of it. You. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. It was everything she had ever wanted to hear, but it was more than the words now. It was the weight of his actions behind them. He had proven it. He had burned the old kingdom down to build a new one, here, with her. Come, she said, her voice stronger now. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her ring a cool, solid presence between their palms. She led him toward the small wooden table. You must be starving. It was a simple, domestic act, but it felt monumental. An acceptance. A beginning. She busied herself at the hearth, adding a log to the fire, filling a kettle with water from a pail. He sat at the table and just watched her, a sense of overwhelming gratitude washing over him. The way the firelight caught the red highlights in her dark hair, the efficient grace of her movements, the quiet competence with which she navigated this small, rustic space. This was her, the woman he loved, in her element, and he was being allowed back into her world. She brought over a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and 2 mugs of steaming herbal tea. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind they hadn't shared in years. It wasn't the tense, angry silence of the palace, but a quiet born of exhaustion and a fragile, nascent peace. He found he was ravenous, the food tasting better than any royal banquet. Here, there were no servants, no courtiers, no ceremony. There was just the two of them, the fire and the vast, quiet forest outside. After they ate, she took his hand again and led him to a small, cushioned bench beside the hearth. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, his arm around her, her head resting on his shoulder. They watched the flames dance and spiral, their light painting flickering patterns on the log walls. Alara loved it here, Maya said, her voice soft and distant. We used to come every summer. We'd fish in the creek and get hopelessly lost in the woods. She would have liked that you came all this way. She always said you had more of a wild heart than you let on. Draven felt a pang of sorrow for the woman whose death had been the catalyst for all of this. She was right, he murmured into her hair. I just forgot how to listen to it. They talked for hours. They talked about her sister, sharing memories that were both joyful and painful. Maya spoke of her last days, of her courage, and of her own profound, numbing grief. And he listened. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer solutions or strategies. He just listened, holding her hand, his presence a quiet, unwavering support. He was finally learning that love wasn't about grand pronouncements or displays of power. It was about the small, sacred act of paying attention. It was about showing up. As the moon climbed high in the sky, casting a silver light over the sleeping forest, a deep, settled peace descended upon the small cabin. The future was still a question mark. Returning to the capital would mean facing a political firestorm of his own making. Rebuilding the trust between them would take more than one night, more than one grand gesture. It would take a lifetime of small, consistent choices. But as Maya finally drifted to sleep, her breathing soft and even against his chest, Draven looked into the glowing embers of the fire and felt not fear, but a quiet, resolute calm. He had made his choice. He had chosen his true north. He tightened his grip on her hand, a silent, sleeping promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. His hand would be in hers. And that, he now knew, was the only kind of power that truly mattered.